school, and the paper that I'm working on I'd like to talk to you about today addresses the question of how we can better incentivize creativity and innovation among employees of firms. So the motivation for this paper came from two observations. The first is that most patentable innovation today takes place in the context of employees working for firms. So to give a number from the Patent Office, between 1973 and 2013, about 87% of patents were assigned to organizations rather than to individual authors. And so what this number suggests, and as most of you know, the common practice is for employees to assign the IP rights to their employers. And so this means that in the majority of cases, the people most directly responsible for innovation are not receiving any direct incentives through the IP system, although firms are receiving economic bonus. But this leads me to my second observation, which is that there's wide variability in how firms treat their employees and what kinds of incentives, both financial and non-financial, they offer to employees. So just an example of a firm doing something that you wouldn't expect to be super motivating for an employee. This is a case that was filed in California. Intermex forced all their employees to install tracking software. Someone recognizes this case that tracked the physical movements of employees 24/7. And when a particular employee, Arias, disabled the software, she was fired. On the other hand, you can think of firms that are particularly forward-thinking in the types of incentives, both financial and non-financial, that they offer to employees. And maybe Google comes to mind as one of these. They offer a number of non-financial incentives, including the ability to work 20% of your time on personal projects and extended leave and vacation time. And as we know, Google's been really successful at generating creative output. So these observations led me to two questions. The first is, what actually motivates employees in the firm context to be creative? Is it salary or bonus, or do some of these other non-financial incentives, like those offered by Google, play a role? And can we develop a framework that can help us systematically evaluate whether what a particular firm is doing is good for innovation or bad for innovation? And if we know what works, and I'll argue that we do, how can we make sure that more employees are receiving the right kinds of incentives? Should we regulate? Should we do nothing at all? And is there a role for IP? And I'll argue that there is a role for IP, but that it's actually a secondary role. So to answer the first question, I looked to the organizational behavior and psychology literature, and there's a wealth of empirical work on the topic of what motivates employees. And for those of you who are familiar with this work, you won't be surprised to learn that bonuses and rewards for creative work are actually not very effective at motivating creative work. So salary is probably important to give to your employees for reasons having to do with stress and creativity that I won't get into, but specifically in terms of motivating creative work through financial bonuses, it looks like money's not that effective. Instead, employees are most creative in environments that de-emphasize the financial aspects and emphasize social exchange relationships. So what's a social exchange? It's less formal than an economic exchange. To give an example of a social exchange relationship you might have with a neighbor, you might feed your neighbor's cat for her while she's out of town. That neighbor might be me, because I'm often asking people to feed my cat. And you're not going to ask for immediate payment, but maybe in a few months when you need a ride to the airport, you think of your neighbor and you give her a call. Similarly, in the workplace, your manager might let you take the afternoon off to go see your daughter's recital, and you can imagine you might feel more motivated a few weeks later when there's a big deadline coming up, putting in long hours. And the empirical work shows that employees are actually more creative also in these types of environments. So social exchanges are built on trust, dignity, and respect, and they can be encouraged by accommodating the special needs and interests of employees, giving employees a voice in decision-making, and giving them credit for their work. There are a number of other factors that I identify from the organizational behavior literature that contribute to employee creativity. I won't go into them in detail for sake of time, but they include autonomy, fostering a sense of competence among your employees, relatedness and social relationships among employees, giving them a variety of tasks so that they avoid cognitive burnout, and helping them achieve work-life balance. And in general, all of these can be kind of encouraged or promoted by promoting a sense of choice among employees, avoiding undue controlling behaviors, giving them credit for their work, and encouraging them to take lots of breaks and to have downtime. So if we have this framework, can we evaluate specific policies? So for example, the employee tracking example that I talked about at the beginning of this talk. Do you think it's good or bad for creativity? Well, it turns out if we use this framework, looks like it's not very good for employee creativity, in particular because it runs up against the principles of social exchange, autonomy, competence, and balance. On the other hand, remote and flexible work policies and some of the policies instituted by Google, like the 2080 work time policy, under this framework appear to be really good for employee creativity for many of the opposite reasons. Okay, so now I'll move on to my second question, which is, if we know what kinds of things work, how can we make sure that more employees are receiving the right incentives? And I look at three options in my paper. The first is IP law, which is directly incentivizing employees with patent or copyright incentives. The second is directly regulating firms and telling them what types of incentives to give to their employees. And the third is private ordering. Let firms work out for themselves what's best for their employees. And I'll explain now that I believe that private ordering is the best approach, but because of specific failures of private ordering, that IP law and direct regulation, in particular employment law, can play secondary roles. So before I get to that, I want to just take a minute and talk about why I did not choose IP as the primary mechanism for this, because most of us in this room, when we think about incentivizing innovation, we think about IP law. The first reason is a lot of people before me in the IP space have written about why giving IP rights to employees is inefficient. It leads to fracturing of rights, it causes potential hold-up problems, and all of this can lead to suboptimal investment in innovation by firms. And I agree with and adopt this view in my paper. Secondly, if you think about the kind of incentive IP provides, it's a primarily financial incentive. And as I just finished telling you, money is not the best motivator for employees in the workplace. It's these other kinds of incentives, touchy-feely incentives. And that leads to my third point, which is that firms are in a much better position to provide these types of incentives than a centralized IP system. So it's really easy to think about how a manager can develop a social exchange relationship with her employees, but it's a little bit harder to imagine the patent office developing a social exchange relationship with an individual employee mentor over time. So if not IP, then why private ordering? Well, my main argument for this is an intuitive one, which is that it's in the firm's best interest to do this, and so they should want to do it. So empirical research shows that when these types of incentives are offered, employees are not only more creative, they're more happy, they're more satisfied, there's less turnover, they're more motivated and more productive, all of which should positively affect the bottom line for firms. And some firms like Google have clued into this and are using it to their advantage. But this raises the question, if it's so great for firms, why isn't every firm doing this? And why are people like Intermex doing these dumb things? And to answer this question, I looked to the corporate law literature about why private ordering sometimes fails. And there are a few insights that I think are relevant here. And I'll talk about those in my proposed solutions and preliminary solutions. So the first reason private ordering may fail is when there's bounded rationality. So in this case in particular, firms might not do what's in their best interest because of information processing limitations. I told you there's a lot of information out there about what works, and I summarized some of it, but I think this very wealth of information may make it hard for firms to assimilate it and to apply it in useful ways. There's a status quo bias, which leads people to prefer and firms to prefer business as usual, even if it's not rational. And there's a conformity bias, which leads people to prefer doing what their peers are doing. So if everyone's kind of doing stuff that's bad for innovation, then any given firm will likely be doing that too. So what corporate law scholars have proposed as a solution to this, and I think it's also a good idea in this context, is metrics. So a simple example of a metric in this context would be a guidepost for a firm. Do you offer a training program for your managers, teaching them how to develop social exchange relationships with their employees? Yes or no? So this provides just a simple cognitive shortcut, a guidepost, helps firms overcome bounded rationality in informational processing problems. If the metrics are public, it could also help overcome the status quo and conformity biases, because potential employees, potential investors, other firms are privy to that information. So the second reason private ordering may fail is when there's information asymmetries. So this is the market for lemons problem. Used car buyers will reduce their willingness to pay because they don't know whether a car is a lemon, and then the seller will only, in response, only offer lemons for sale, and then the market eventually collapses. Here I analogize used car buyers to employees. So I told you empirical research shows that when there are innovation incentives, employees are not only more creative, but they're also happier. So we would expect that all things like salary being equal, employees would prefer to work for firms that offer these incentives. And this, in a perfect market situation, would tend to push firms towards adopting these innovation incentives. But because of information asymmetries, employees don't have the kind of information they need before taking a job. So there are some mechanisms like Glassdoor, or you could do a little bit of research about what your firm's like, but really you don't know whether your manager's going to be a jerk or not before you take a job. And so the solution that is used in the used car market is certification. So sellers who have good cars will offer, certified pre-owned car. They'll send a signal at some cost themselves to certify their car. And I propose that the same thing could be done here, where firms could voluntarily waive in to certification programs where they're meeting certain metrics, meeting certain standards, and that information would be available to investors and to potential employees. So the third reason private ordering sometimes fails is when social norms lead firms to act in ways that aren't rational. So here in particular, you could imagine that if there's a social norm in a firm or an industry for managers to act in controlling ways or to not give their employees credit for their work, that this could keep firms from acting in innovation-enhancing ways. And so this is finally where I propose a role for IP law, because social norms can be influenced and molded by legal institutions. And what better institution to mold social norms around the treatment of creators than IP law? And in particular, I propose an attribution right for employee creators so that employees could get credit for their work independent of who owns the financial exclusive rights in their work. And this could help create a social norm for giving employees credit for their work regardless of whether it's done in the firm context or independently. And then finally, private ordering may fail when there are unequal power or wealth distributions. And here there are clearly power disparities among employers and employees. Employees cannot necessarily leave jobs that they don't like, that don't have these innovation-promoting incentives. And these are made worse by measures that restrict employee mobility, including non-compete agreements. And so here's where I propose a role for direct regulation, specifically laws that make it harder for firms to restrict employee mobility. So I know I went through that all very fast, but quickly my conclusions. What motivates employees to be creative? A number of factors that I identified, which basically boil down to treating your employees well. And how can we ensure employees receive appropriate incentives? I argue that private ordering should take a primary role with correcting for failures in private ordering using metrics, certification, IP law, and employment law. So thank you. And yes.
So 1.5 or 2 related questions. Number one, on your attribution argument, there's not paper, so I can't see.
Yeah.
Did you look at my colleague Catherine Fisk's historiography on?
Yes, so I cite that heavily, credit where credit is due.
Okay.
Yes.
Because I thought that would be useful too. And then on the, I guess, did you do any comparative work? So for example, Germany has a mandatory employee royalty statute. Japan has a funny kairitsu thing that they do. The UK has a very complicated employee statute, and you could potentially look at outcomes for your regulation argument based on what corporation outcomes you find in different jurisdictions.
Okay, yeah, I haven't looked at that, but that's really useful.
Yeah, that would be really useful to Brett McDonald and me, so if you did that, that would be great.
Okay, great.
I have a more general question and a somewhat more specific question. The more general question is, how is this, I see that we're at Ipsc sort of motivated by creativity, but it also seems to like just like ways to treat your employee nicely.
Right.
Let's do these things because then that would be nice.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's a specific hook as to why this is just creativity versus everyone's happier and life is better and workers work harder and all of that kind of stuff.
What country do you live in?
So wait,
and the other
that question. So why
why don't you just do the right thing?
I mean, I think other literature suggests that when employees are happier, then they also do things like work harder and more efficiently and get things done better and yada yada and all this stuff. So I'm wondering if there is a specific reason that these are interventions that are specifically now creativity is better versus just happier employees, better things. The other question on that is with regard to the attribution thing. Do you see a difference between kind of types of creativity where there already is kind of automatic attribution versus not? And so I would think here about patenting, where you're a listed human inventor, even if you've assigned the right, versus other things where maybe if you come up with a work for hire, your name doesn't get on it. So I don't know if there's any difference there.
So for the first question, I guess the focus of the paper is really how do we develop a more robust innovation policy, and we're overlooking this big proportion of inventors who aren't receiving direct IP incentives. And so I really focus on the empirical literature that looks not only at our workers happier, but they are specific and more productive, but specifically that they're more creative and more innovation is produced in those environments. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question. And then for the attribution part, I am kind of focusing on patentable innovation, and it's true that inventors get listed on their patents regardless of whether the patent is assigned to their employers or not. But I'm going to argue for a more robust attributional right for inventors, because I really don't think that that's sufficient to kind of, and based on the psychology literature again, to kind of meet the psychological needs. They can put it on their resume, but it gets filed away, and whoever reads it, except for the patent agent kind of thing. And so really a robust attribution where they're really kind of getting credit and feedback and recognition for their work. Yes?
Yeah, a couple things. First, on the point you just made on attribute, I don't know, how would that work with a smartphone that's covered by 250,000 patents, right? The attribution on the product would be pretty small, but attribution on the patent is already pretty good, I guess. But that's an aside. So, I mean, my main comment was really on the sort of your framing of the question, right? I mean, this paper seems to be an exploration of different private ordering mechanisms and how to optimize private ordering to achieve these results. But you frame it, up front as a comparison or a sort of qualitative assessment between IP law versus regulation versus private ordering, but you're not really doing that, right? I mean, the IP law exists. You're not proposing that it be abolished or changed in some way. We've got a default IP regime, which is different for copyright and patent, but it sounds to me like you're just living with that, right? And again, it's a pretty big step to propose change. So we're just living with that, and so I might start out by just laying out what the baseline default IP regime is, and then attacking the problem is what is the best private ordering mechanism within the existing IP law framework to optimize these results, right? Because it's not really, it's kind of a paper tiger to say, well, IP law versus private ordering, we're going to go with private ordering.
Right.
You're not changing the IP law.
Yeah, okay, yes, that's really helpful. Yes.
I'm wondering if you looked at the open, whether company, the benefits of the open innovation model for this. Because some companies obviously tie down the information flows within a company and also require non-disclosure agreements, excuse me. So I wonder if you have any, you included that in your.
No, I haven't included that or anything like that yet, but yeah, it's very.
There is a lot of literature on that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting, by the way. This is really interesting. I actually have a comment that follows on some of the ones people have, or a question that follows on what people said before, which has to do with attribution could mean a couple of different things, right? It could mean attribution within the firm, like within the group of people. And I think that companies probably do have a lot of ways that they do that, even if they aren't like very specific.
Right.
And to some extent that just becomes known, like so-and-so's the one who always has the great ideas, right? But then there's attribution to outsiders. And if you're talking about attribution to outsiders, that might be where, and maybe this is why you think we need IP law for it, but that might be where the commonality of interests between the employees and the employer falls apart, right? And maybe society. Because the employer has reasons for not wanting to have attribution. They don't want to lose their employees. So I'm just wondering, I think it might make sense to talk separately about attribution within, what it can accomplish, and then whether you also need attribution outside.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I never really thought about that potential drawback of attribution before. And some of this is counterintuitive. With the employee mobility in particular, firms will start doing things that are really good for their inventors, for example, Google, and then they'll get in this conspiracy where other firms saying, okay, don't poach our employees, we won't poach yours, but that's actually counterproductive to creativity. And so there's this kind of balancing act, and then when the employees get really good, there's always this kind of intuition by firms like we have to rein it in. So yeah, that's a really interesting dynamic. Thanks. Yes.
Does that beeping mean the time?
It is. I'm trying to get it off. It means we're done with this presentation, actually.
We can talk after.
Okay. Yeah.